So I am from the University of Hull. This is specifically from an operating department practice perspective, because we were the first ones in our faculty to use PebblePad for that reason. Now when I looked at the presentation briefing, it said to talk around your study rather than talk about what's in the book, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of do this as a bit of our journey through PebblePad, where we started, what we've learned, and what I'm going to take away from this week as well, because surprisingly I've learned a lot that I didn't expect I was going to find out about. I have a tendency to move around a lot, so please tell me to stand still if I do. I get a bit active during my teaching sessions. And I do talk quite fast, so please tell me to slow down if I'm waffling on. So just to give you a bit of background really about our programme, we've been running as a programme since 2003, but we've seen growth in student recruitment through the years. So we started as a diploma of higher education and then moved on. So the way our programme works is ever so slightly different to the Nursing and Midwifery Council courses, which are 50% practice theory. We have a 60-40 split. So 60% of the time of our students is spent out in the clinical environment, and 40% is spent in the classroom doing theoretical work. All of our students are given what's called a home trust. So for us, we work over quite a big regional area. So we have placements up in Scarborough, placements out in York, for any of you who know the areas, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Goole and Hull and East Yorkshire. So we cover quite a big patch. But one of the reasons for giving our students a home trust is because we realise that the intensity of the healthcare professional courses means that they're going to have a lot of their time spent taken up with studying, so we don't want to add to that travel if we can help it. We've always used our clinical assessment on paper. It's been a paper-based portfolio. It's just the traditional way of doing things in health professional education. And the way it's set out is based around learning outcomes, which are broken down into performance criteria. So for us, we have, since we've changed our programme, we've gone to 6 core learning outcomes, and each semester they're broken down into the performance criteria, which our student must demonstrate their competence of in practice. So in 2013 we went through a major change, because in 2011 our curriculum was updated to include a lot more core skills that the ODP has to be able to do in their clinical work. So we went through revalidation and we went from diploma to BSc. This for us was really our opportunity to do the things we wanted to do. I was new at the time. I was on a secondment, lecturer practitioner, and I got tasked with looking at the practice document. Yay. So I thought, right, where do I start with these sort of 2 years of competencies and what do we do? And the first thing that came to my mind was really, why on earth are we doing it on paper? Because from the time I'd been at the university, I had seen workbooks with blood on them. Workbooks which looked like they had been chewed by the dog. So I think when a student says the dog ate their homework, they possibly are telling the truth sometimes. So I kind of made this hint to one of my colleagues about, have we thought about doing this as an e-portfolio and try and move with the times a bit? And she went, well, it's funny you should say that actually, because I've just come back from she's an associate dean, so she came back from quite an important meeting and said, actually, we've just met with Patrick Lynch, who spoke earlier today, and we've just bought a site license for PebblePad. So that was kind of the start of our journey into using PebblePad for our programme. So because we'd seen all those issues we'd had in the past, we thought this is obviously going to be the next best step. It's obviously going to be bought into by everybody. The whole faculty is going to love it. Maybe not so much. We've still got some buy-in to do, I think. Oh, no, my slides aren't playing. I'm going to talk you through my slides because for some reason it doesn't want to play. Ooh, okay, never mind. I'll talk you through it. So,
you keep talking.
So we went through the revalidation process and we said, right, let's look at how we can set PebblePad up. One of the important things for us in doing that process was that we wanted to know that we had at least some level of buy-in from our practice staff. All the colleagues in our team were a very close team. We get on very well, so we were all very much onto this thinking, yeah, it's the next move. We had rumblings from the clinical staff that they weren't overly keen. They thought access was going to be a big issue. But generally speaking, our clinical practice educators, so the people that allocate our students to placements and look after them while they're on placement, they were really on for this. They said, no, this is a really good move. They'd had issues in the past where a student had taken their clinical workbook into practice, given it to their mentor and said, can you look at this tonight, please? And the workbook never comes back again. So for us, that transparency of the system was also going to be a really big plus. So we started working with Patrick Lynch from our Technology Enhanced Learning team to build our portfolio and put that together. And as you can see, this is the V5 version, but just to kind of give you an example of how our competencies are set out on there. So we have the overarching performance criteria. And one of the things that we did with our assessment at the point of changing onto the e-portfolio was also refresh how a student could be assessed. So this has a bit of an impact on some of the things we found in our study around the student engagement. So we can't be 100% certain that PebblePad was the main reason for liking it as such. But one of the things we did, originally every student for every performance criteria had to write a reflective statement. So that meant they were producing near enough 17,000 words on average a semester on top of a 4,000 word assignment. So naturally we had to move away from that. So we thought, well, it's clinical practice. Yeah, writing things down is great, but actually, are we doing enough with this? Because really, they're in practice, there's got to be other ways that they're getting assessed. So we moved to a model of observation, discussion, and written work, so that we could give the mentors a little bit more flexibility as well, because we knew anecdotally that they were really struggling with time to read through students' work, and that a lot of them actually would sit with their student and talk through the learning outcomes and say, yeah, I'll sign that off before they'd even handed any written work in. So there must have been a better way around it. So we moved to that model. The student logs on and they choose how they've been evidenced, and then the assessor field is filled in by the mentor through Atlas. And the system seems to work really well. It gives us an opportunity to have that insight into what's going on while our students are out on placement as well. Because for us, one of the other issues, and I'm sure this is probably a very common issue across any health professional programme, is that there's that issue of if a student has a problem in placement, we don't really find out about it until it's snowballed right down the hill and turned into a really big mess that actually is really difficult to fix. So we introduced at the same time a RAG rating system. So when our students go for their reviews with their mentor, we kind of took advantage of the e-portfolio here in terms of this wouldn't just be a discussion with your mentor about how you're doing. We added in that the student would have to put their own prior reflections in on how they think they're doing first. And then once the action plan had been developed, the mentor would give a RAG rating, so red, amber or green, depending on how that student's progressing. We did ask students how they felt about that first as well. We wanted to get a feel for whether or not they saw red as being a negative thing. That did come across, but once they actually started to get used to the system, they started to see that as actually a mechanism for support rather than a mechanism for saying you're failing. So I think it was just how we dealt with that changed that response. But that allows us to log in. So one of the great things about having the e-portfolio is that we've been able to check in on our students. If we hear a rumbling about a mentor in practice maybe going off sick, we can see if our student has got signed off with someone else. But also the other really good thing is, because I don't think we ever truly trusted our mentors that they were doing the assessment throughout the whole semester. There was definitely students that were getting everything signed off in the last week and backdated. I'm sure there was. With this, we've now got a little bit more of a realistic picture of that in terms of we can see when those buttons have been clicked by the mentor. I'm not going to say this came easy. I think we've had a very positive experience, but it came with pitfalls along the way. So for us, one of the first iterations of our workbook that Patrick put together, he was really keen that we have the written signature, the digital signature in our workbook. Part of that also came from clinical practice, because mentors said to us, no, we like a physical signature because it means we have put ownership on that document. So we put it in. And as you all know, in the clinical area, computers aren't the easiest to get hold of, and when they are, it's not usually a tablet so that you can sign with your finger, it's actually a mouse. So the signatures that we were getting back didn't resemble anything like the mentor's signatures. So in the end, we actually said, well, wouldn't we be better just having an assessor field that says met or not met? And then once that's been ticked as met, we can see who exactly signed it off and the date and time. So we moved forward with that model. It looks much tidier in the workbook and it's worked much better. And we haven't got mentors moaning at us that it's a ridiculous system, which the signature just didn't work for us in that way. because that kind of leads me down into thinking about tablet use. For us, our ideal situation was going to be our students will go into clinical practice, they'll take their iPads with them. So very similar to what you're doing at Sheffield. We say on our reading list, we recommend that you actually get a tablet rather than buying all the books, so that you can use that throughout your studies. But we came up with this really big barrier in that, yes, our local trusts have Wi-Fi, but we aren't allowed access to it. The students aren't allowed on it, it's purely for the clinical networks. And that would be great if the cellular access was really good, but it generally isn't across the site. So people step on site and suddenly their mobile phone is redundant, their iPad is redundant. So it meant that we've had to rely very heavily on PC access, which has been, I think, one of the biggest negatives for us really in the whole process, in that we've had students really panicking, saying, oh, we can't get access to a PC because they're either all being used in the operating theatre and we can't interrupt, we haven't got time to go out and find one. However, on the flip side of that, where we have had those worries, we've talked to our students, we are very close to our students, and we've said, look, put an extension request in. If you've genuinely had an issue because the system isn't allowing you to fulfil your requirements, then we will support that. And then you always find that by the end of the semester, they've somehow magically managed to find a PC and actually get signed off. So that's been not as big an issue as we actually really thought it was going to be. For us, in terms of the workbook, we originally just saw it as that. It was going to be a replacement for our clinical portfolio, but then you get to know PebblePad a little bit and you have a play with some of the other tools that are available and start thinking of all the different things that you can do. And certainly this week's been a big eye-opener for me in terms of some of the other things that I've scribbled down in my notebook that I'm going to take back and start implementing across our programme. So just some of the sort of things that we have done. And I did have a screenshot of our tutorial log. So what we used to do with tutorials for our students was we used to get them to come and see us, we'd write things down and we'd file it away. So the students never got a copy of their tutorial, so you couldn't really set a viable action plan. There was no moving forward with whatever you set at that tutorial unless your student was really good and took notes. So we said, well, I said, much to my colleagues, they weren't too keen, I don't think at first, said, why don't we move that into PebblePad too? Oh, not more PebblePad. Yeah, more PebblePad, it's great. So I set up a tutorial workbook, and that's replaced a lot of paper-based exercises for us, because not only does it replace the tutorial, but also every semester we bring our students in on the first morning back, and that first morning back, it's administrative. It is module evaluations. Can you complete a SWOT analysis of your previous clinical placement? Can you fill in a clinical CV? And these are some of the processes we definitely want our students to do, because we know from the past that going to an interview, they were getting asked for their personal and professional development portfolios. So I said, but we're printing off 3 sheets for the clinical CV, 2 sheets for this one, and it was meaning about 7 or 8 sheets of paper per student every semester when we really didn't need to be doing that. So alongside our tutorial logs, we included the clinical CV. The really nice thing with PebblePad is it means that rather than having loose sheets which notoriously get left in a carrier bag somewhere in a room in your house and forgotten about unless you're really organised, it meant that they were all together, so the student could rate their skills and attributes from a scale of 1 to 5. They could go back to it next semester very easily and go, actually, I feel like I've improved there, or actually, I feel like I need to do a bit more work here. And that could then feed into tutorials, because we had some more transparency ourselves. It meant we could see what the students were saying. It's also meant, because of Atlas, because we get them to submit the tutorial workbook, it's within the overall workbook is the personal and professional development portfolio, and that is auto-submitted to Atlas. So it also means that when they fill their SWOT analysis in of their clinical placements, a lot of them didn't used to hand them in, or they would hand them in and we couldn't read them. Now it means we can just download a report through Atlas and we can collate all of those issues together and address clinical practice. So it's made that a much more streamlined process for us as well. So that's been another really exciting thing that we've been able to do with it. Also, I'm an admissions tutor. I have the joy of all the UCAS applications that come in, which interestingly all get printed on paper still at the moment for us. Yeah, I know, it's scary, isn't it? Too much paper. So for us, we were sat in a meeting and we said, right, we've really got to start working on our welcome packs because the students are starting in, I think it was about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And someone said, yeah, well, we need to send them the reading list and we need to send them the induction timetable and we need to send them the registration details and we need to send them the details of their time slots. I said, well, are we going to print all that and post it? That's going to be a really big job, isn't it? They went, well, central admission said they're not going to do it for us anymore, so we're going to have to do it in faculty. So I said, well, let's put it on PebblePad. My colleagues, I think, are starting to hate me. So they said, oh, well, no, we don't know what we're doing with that. I said, well, give me some time, let me go off for an hour and I'll put something together. And it was literally as simple as that. I went away and I developed a workbook which has generic faculty information and then it has several nested workbooks throughout it for each of our undergraduate programmes, with all of those documents either available as an image or a downloadable PDF. We sent it as an external link. And fingers crossed, it went out on Friday to my students, and I've only had one student come back so far who has said, it's asking me to log in. Sent her the link again, and she's been absolutely fine. So I think she was doing something wrong along the way somewhere. So it sounds like that's been really useful. For me, thinking about moving forward in the future, we want to really look at our practice portfolio and redevelop that. I think there's certainly from things we've heard this week, the OSCE style stuff, I would love to do some of the recordings and things like that and embed those. But getting that feel of the portfolio being more than the clinical portfolio, I think, is the really big next step. And following on from sort of Debbie's talk, really, you know, we don't know what students are taking up those alumni accounts, and I think for us, we want our students to do that because they are our mentors of the future, and when they come and do mentorship with us, it's on PebblePad. So we really want them to start engaging with that process as a whole. The other thing is across faculty. So the ODP team are notoriously the guinea pigs in faculty, partly because we have smaller cohorts, partly because we're willing to try stuff out. We're not afraid to take on a new challenge. It's a bit fun for us, quite frankly. So we tried PebblePad, other people saw it, mentorship's now on it, community nursing's now on it, and the plan is, I believe, that nursing will go onto it from September 2017. So we're fighting for some administrative support for that, but that would be brilliant to get our entire faculty rolled onto PebblePad and using it for all sorts of different things. I'd like to see appraisals go on there. Currently I keep my own appraisal record on there, but I think we've got a bit of work to do yet with our colleagues in seeing that that process can be a lot more longitudinal if we keep it on PebblePad rather than keep coming back to bits of paper and losing bits and pieces. So generally we have had a really positive experience. The students have liked it. Again, because of the change in assessment, I can't say that that's all to do with PebblePad. Some of that's probably because they don't have to do all the written work anymore. Certainly the students that were in my study that had done the written work for a year and then PebblePad for a year, they said, oh, we can see the advantage of not having to write everything. But they did like the fact that it kept everything in one place. They would love to have seen better access, but they understood that it meant that their mentors, if they wanted, could access it from home as well. So they weren't restricted by time. So overall, very positive experience. I think that's it. Thank you.